Welcome back to the first full team edition of the Hidden History Happy Hour for 2023. Alex, cheers. You'll see my glass is empty.
Well, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready for booze chat when you're ready to. My glass is currently empty as well.
Well, we're very introspective people here on the Hidden History Happy Hour, and we try to always make things a little bit better for you, our listeners. And one of the things we realized after our first year, empty cheers for our first year, is we haven't talked as much about booze as we promised you. And, some of you complain. Now, for those of you who complain, you better be writing in and tell us what booze stories you want us to talk about. But I have a doozy for today that ties right into our first story from More Lessons from History, not the OG, Volume 2. But first, Alex, and I'm doing this without a cocktail because this is how seriously I take it. We need to address, and I'm not being partisan here in the United States, the elephant in the room. Republicans are elephants, Democrats are donkeys here in the U.S., or asses, as some people would say. There's been a lot of chatter, Alex, about the fact that you and I have appeared so many separate episodes at the end of 2022. Why weren't we together? Somebody sick? Is there a tiff between you? And I just would like to set the record straight for all of our viewers who have speculated that we may not like each other that much. You're wrong. We hate each other. We can't stand each other. We've never been able to stand each other.
Thanks, Brian. That's really nice.
This is all a joke, people. We've had travel schedules. Alex was on his honeymoon. In case you haven't figured this out yet, we're not in the same location. We're 7 or 8 time zones away. So it's just holiday scheduling, nothing to worry about. We're the best of friends. You will see us live in London. More notes about that coming soon. Right, Alex? Or do you want to dispute me?
No, that is correct.
All right. Now let's talk about the booze. So we are going to tell a story today, one of my favorite stories now from More Lessons from History, about Ernest Hemingway's brother. And I don't remember if I've mentioned this before on the show, but I love Hemingway. This is why, as all of our viewers know, I use so few words, because I'm such a fan of Hemingway. And I've read everything, I'm pretty sure. And I grew up very close to where his Michigan stories were located. And I've dug in over the years into the mythology of Ernest Hemingway, which there is a lot of. One of which, I hope I haven't told this story on the podcast before, but if I have, our viewers will indulge me and our new viewers will hopefully appreciate it. Alex, do you recall that Ernest Hemingway was once approached in a bar in Miami and offered a bar bet, which I know, pub wager, I know you love there.
Yep.
And the bet was, what is the shortest full short story you can write?
We did this live.
Did we tell this before?
We did this live when we were in New York, and I gave the punchline.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to do it again because a lot of people weren't in New York. Yeah. So Hemingway, a legend has it, takes out a cocktail napkin and writes on the napkin, "Baby shoes for sale.
Never used."
Never used. Which
for sale.
Just gets you, right?
Baby shoes never used.
Yeah. So that's thing one. Thing two, though, getting back to the booze, which we promised a minute ago, is I believe if you went and asked 20 random people who know anything about Hemingway, what is his favorite drink? What was Hemingway's favorite drink? They would say, got a guess, Alex?
Yes, I do, actually. It's going to be something he was having in Cuba. So pisco sour, or was he having lots of margaritas?
You're in the right ballpark. You're adjacent.
Okay. All right, go on.
Most people would say it was the mojito. And a big reason they would say that is there's a particular bar in Havana which has a framed, and we'll put this in the show notes, a framed handwritten note signed Ernest Hemingway, which says, "My mojito is at La Botiquita," forgiveness for the pronunciation. "My daiquiri is El Floridita." Well, it turns out this is a complete fabrication. And nowadays, Alex, when we have no sense of humor, this would result in multiple lawsuits. But the owner of this particular bar thought it would be funny. He knew Hemingway. He had Hemingway's actual handwriting to just fake this. And tens of thousands of people have flocked to this bar over the years, thinking that this is authentic. And according to this article in eater.com, which we'll put in the show notes, there is absolutely no evidence at all that Hemingway ever enjoyed a mojito. And Hemingway, as you know, wrote a lot about the drinks he drank. You'd think if he had drank a mojito, there would be some written record of it. Now, what he did drink and is documented, Alex, is what you're drinking.
I am having some rum today, actually. I'm not having a gin. So I'm sorry. I misled you. I was going to have some, but he sure as hell had some rum.
Yes.
I am having a rum called Takamaka, which may be familiar to anyone who's been lucky enough to go to the Seychelles. I bought an industrial-sized duty-free bottle coming back from my honeymoon, and I'm going to have it with some ice. And this Takamaka, many purists will disapprove, but this is a coconut flavored rum, and just designed for the teenage market and
Sure.
and I find it absolutely delicious for an early evening tipple, an aperitif.
Well, it makes perfect sense that the Seychelles would produce good rum, but I have never heard that before. So that's news for our fans. Booze news.
Booze news. It is good. Will, of course, concede they're not famous for it, but they're not really famous for producing alcohol of any kind, and most countries do produce alcohol of some kind or other. The other thing I was thinking about for your Cuban connections, Cuba Libre. He must have, but it's Hemingway that took me to. There's the word fine or fiend for a brandy. Means a particular quality of brandy, which he refers to offhand in, I think it must be A Movable Feast when he's in Paris. But I'm sure he has some of his characters talk about it as well as in his memoirs. And Hemingway drinks a few fiends or fines at the end of a night. And so I years ago went away and looked that up, which I had to look up again embarrassingly, because I'm reading at the moment Alec War's memoirs, the older, less successful brother of Evelyn Waugh, which ties in with the story we're going to tell. Brothers who haven't enjoyed quite the same success. Alec War's memoirs consist mostly of long stories at which the punchline is a minor celebrity of the 1930s, so the name doesn't mean anything to you, wrapped around his disclosure that he would put a ring around the date of any date in which he got his leg over. And doggedly tells you each and every time he was successful in 1931 in scoring with the opposite sex. But he does tell a story about, which I'm determined to get into volume 3, at least as a footnote, of he and his brother sitting on their tradition. If they saw a girl they liked at the same time, they would toss a coin, and the one who won the coin toss got 3 days of uninterrupted first opportunity before the other could try. I mean, on the one hand, it's really crass. On the other hand, it's quite telling about these two brothers. So it wasn't wasted time reading, in addition to reminding me of fine brandy.
Well, there probably have been sisters have done it, similar thing, just to be non-genderist about it. Now, I am going to be enjoying what is documented as one of Hemingway's favorite drinks, and it comes from one of his favorite bars and one of his favorite bartenders, again in Havana, and the bartender's name is Gregorio, so it's called Gregorio's RX. And the official cocktail that apparently Papa enjoyed, at least according to the marketing of the bar, was rum, of course, 1 ounce of honey syrup made from a ratio of 1-to-1 water and honey, which I can't do that, so I've got to substitute. Ounce of lime juice.
Too sweet for you?
It's too, and also just the idea of honey plus water. I don't know. I'd say honey or water, not the mix. And then mint leaves, which I don't have, so I'm not going to have that, and lime juice. But other than that, all the proportions are the same. I've put it in a shaker. I'm going to do this off camera, but shaken, not stirred. I'm going to do this off camera because there's a high likelihood I will spill it all over myself if I try to do it in front of the camera. Oh, looks good though. I got to say, looks pretty good. All right. So I'm going to post the recipe in the show notes.
That does look good.
Well, let me wait before I make a recommendation.
Okay.
Yes, I would say our fans should try that. Probably more of a summer drink than this time of year, but it's summer in the Seychelles, right?
It is. Now, as you're talking about that, actually, I'm not sure it is the summer. I think anyway.
Summer somewhere, Australia.
Summer somewhere. As you were telling that, it reminded me that we were in a bar once, and someone that we used to know was trying to order a particular type of whiskey, and this whiskey had a honey variant, and they were trying. That's not what they ordered, and they got the one with honey. And They went back to the bar and said, "You give me the one with honey, can I have the one without?" They, without objection, exchanged the glasses for another one with the honey in it. And this person was getting and more annoyed. And of course, if that happens once, it's not particularly funny. It happened like 10 times.
Yeah.
And we were all getting drunker and drunker anyway. So the objection made less and less sense. And it just kept coming. And I realized there was actually, other than the bar closing or one of us dying or something, there was going to be no end to the succession of free unconsumed honey flavored drinks. So that's what your honey cocktail makes me think about.
It was Whiskey Groundhog Day.
It was.
Yeah, Groundhog Day coming up. I don't know if we'll have a Groundhog Day episode or not. What we will have eventually, though, is a first-year retrospective episode where we put clips of our favorite episodes and we just talk a little bit about them. So all of you guys out there, write in, tell us what your favorite episodes are that we might like to feature in our one-year anniversary. And again, cheers to everybody who's been with us, stuck with us. It's been a great year.
It's been a great year.
Alex is a whole book later. We're both either married or engaged. And I credit it all to the Hidden History Happy Hour.
I credit much of it to the Hidden History Happy Hour. I'm not sure. My wife, of course, predated the books by several years. So
it is
slightly
true.
Unfair. What was I going to say? I was always going to say, because when we post this episode, we'll have just had Martin Luther King Day in the United States. People should go back and listen to the episode that we cut with Terry. It must have been episode 2, I think, back at the beginning. So it's not a visual episode, I'm afraid, but the audio is really, really good about Martin Luther King.
Yeah, that was our second episode, and our first episode was a little bit personal for me, so I think putting that in our second episode was pretty good on our part, and we will certainly get back to those themes, but have a listen and also let us know what your favorite episodes are so that we can do them in our annual review. And without further ado, Alex, unless you have any more ado.
I do. I have no more ado.
Let's talk about Ernest Hemingway's brother.
All right. You've already changed the order, but I'll do that. I
like to keep it fresh.
No, fair enough. We were just talking about Hemingway. Look, it's not a slight on Lester Hemingway to say that he was a less successful writer than Ernest, because who otherwise related or not has achieved more renown. But despite having published a novel based on his wartime experience, Lester, who the history books say was a man of charm and bonhomie, who took pride in rather than resenting his brother's successes, was really not breaking any literary records. And indeed, his most successful book was imaginatively and unpredictably called My Brother, Ernest Hemingway. I mean, it's as unimaginative as calling a sequel More Lessons from History, isn't it?
Almost as good.
Yeah, so less conventional than that memoir was what he did with the proceeds. He started a new country. New Atlantis was an 8-foot by 30-foot raft. I have not got those proportions wrong. 8 feet wide, 30 feet long.
By the way, an equally imaginative name for a country as his book.
Indeed. In 1964, when the big bucks from the royalties of his book were rolling in to fund the founding of his new country, he towed that raft 6 miles out from the shore of Jamaica and declared it his own nation. And actually, he was very magnanimous. Half was gifted to the United States, so he claimed half of it as a new country. He had this Guano Act claim that he spuriously suggested helped him prop up the suggestion this was a new country. Anyway, he tethered the raft to an old car engine block. This is very sophisticated, right? This is how you start a country. Yeah. Tethered the raft to an old engine block from a car, which he dropped to the ocean floor, which at this point was unusually, and he'd done his homework, a mere 50 feet deep, rather than much deeper, at a point which was then outside the territorial limits of any country. So, got some land, got some chutzpah, Bob's your uncle, Ernest's your brother, you've got a country. The imaginativeness of our friend Lester's writing is reflected once again in the establishment of New Atlantis' constitution, which is identical to the United States Constitution, with the words United States replaced throughout with the words New Atlantis.
Which is pretty interesting because you got to believe that he wasn't holding slaves or anything. So there had to be a lot of provisions in 1964 that were pretty much superfluous.
Yeah, but it's just easier to copy and paste, right? As anyone in law today will tell you. Small countries dream big. So oceanographic and environmental projects were envisaged. He was really quite far ahead of his time in his desire to clean up the ocean. Stamps, it's always stamps with these micro countries, were issued.
Got to have the stamps.
Indeed. There were plans for expansion of the country's territory. He planned to have huge piles of rocks placed on the seafloor to expand New Atlantis.
Which China is doing now.
Yes, on a more successful scale.
Yeah.
And in a pleasing surprise, I must report that New Atlantis elected Leicester president in a landslide. All right, so that infant country had a rather temporary population of 6. One Lester Hemingway, one Mrs. Lester Hemingway, Hemingway children times 2, and 2, and I say this with great admiration for a discipline I practice myself, 2 plainly rather optimistic public relations practitioners. But things were to grow, was their plan. The trouble was that the dreamers of New Atlantis had forgotten the fate of old Atlantis. It was broken up soon after its glorious birth by a tropical storm, and bits of the state were sunk and bits of the state were salvaged or ransacked by local fishermen, depending on your source of preference, and with no disrespect meant to the treasures of a nation. And without being frivolous about New Atlantis, I don't think it makes much of a difference whether they were salvaging or ransacking. And therefore, not one trace of New Atlantis remains. And in a rare admission of the need to correct something, I wish to revise what I said in volume 1, the OG, Lessons from History, when I maintained that the fire that swept across Sealand, the realm of Prince Roy, was perhaps the worst disaster ever to befall a nation by percentage of territory, because total elimination, being wiped from the face of God's earth, rather tops even that. So look, it's quirky and it's fun, but I'm afraid, Bryan, as usual, you know better than me, a Hemingway fan like me, I'm afraid, as a standard Hemingway yarn turns out, it does not end happily. Lester echoed his famous brother even to the very end, taking his own life in 1962. Excuse me, in 1982. Sorry. But whilst, which ironically, actually, exactly 20 years after he had, 18 years, forgive me, after he'd founded his country. Whilst his new Atlantean venture was plainly pretty quixotic, it was also brave, and it was well-intentioned, and it was a project all of his own, not dependent on others, related or not, and it was trailblazing. So, yeah, as you will know, and there are many famous and wealthy individuals now doing this, seascaping, building permanent, inverted commas, land.
Sometimes called seasteading.
Seasteading too, yeah. Outside existing countries, on the oceans, done for reasons of ecology, philosophy, tax. It's now quite a thing, and it's taken seriously by some people with bigger pockets than Hemingway, but equally big ideas. So I say, score 1 for the lesser-known Hemingway.
Yeah, great story. A lot to say. I'm going to move from the more frivolous to the less frivolous. I guess one, there is a modern seasteading movement, and I've had conversations, actually, strangely enough, with some of the people involved in it. And my first question to them is always the same, and it always goes back to one of my favorite subjects, pirates. It's all well and good to have your own country and your own tax system and your own governance, but what happens when the pirates come? There's no navy.
The trouble is you then invite people who are, commit full tilt, and they say, don't you worry about that. We've got our own defenses too. And I'm not sure that's a good outcome for humanity. If we've armed the state.
If they have those defenses, yeah. And the second thing is, I think it's impossible that our listeners and viewers are not comparing New Atlantis to Sealand, given the OG story. Right. And I haven't actually written a tally down, but it kind of sounds like maybe Mr. Hemingway had more legitimacy than Prince Roy with the vote.
So yes, well, the difference is the difference between a democracy and a monarchy. Obviously, Prince Roy reigned by dint of birthright, and force of arms, whereas President Hemingway ruled by dint of popular will.
I think that's what I said. He had more legitimacy.
Well, no. I was pointing out the flaw in your theory. You're talking about two different systems. You're maintaining one is more legitimate than the other, and
100%, I'm maintaining that.
I, as a British person with the coronation coming up, refute this entirely. I would also say that, of course, Prince Roy's realm lasted for a good deal longer than New Atlantis. Indeed, technically speaking, Sealand continues to exist today, which is not something one can say for New Atlantis, swept from the face of the earth within a year of founding. So, maybe that's an argument for monarchy, Bryan, that you didn't intend to make, but I accept your conclusion.
Yeah, but weather.
Sure. Well, that's God's view on the two systems you just set out. So, okay. I didn't have you down as a monarchist, but I'm delighted to hear it.
All right. I was going to say fair enough, but I can't because it's actually not that fair. And then the serious point, Alex, and I don't think we've talked about this. Maybe we'll talk about it someday, but it kind of brings the podcast down. I actually have suicide in my family a couple generations ago. And so I've looked at this very, very carefully, for the sake of my kids. And it really does run in families. I mean, there is a very genetic... it's the genetic links to depression, genetic links to substance abuse. It's a thing. And, there's all kinds of sociological factors that weigh in as well with his brother. But I have a close relative who had two brothers, both of whom committed suicide under the age of 30. And they're not my brothers, but they're, close to my family. And unfortunately, it is kind of mutually reinforcing.
So, not that I knew we were going to get onto this, but as you know, beneath my rugged populist exterior, I'm deeply pretentious, and I studied literature at university, and in the course of that, famously, Ted Hughes's wife, Sylvia Plath, took her own life.
Yeah.
But so did his next wife.
Yeah.
Right. They both put their heads in the oven. And so there is a point on the other hand. So the argument with all these things is always nature versus nurture.
That's more of a nurture. Yeah.
Right. So there's for every example you can, not every, but, for the examples one can find on the side of the debate you are pointing to about genetics. On the other hand, you can look at a situation and say, the circumstances around somebody is what leads to these things. And perhaps that people who are two women, for argument's sake, two women who are both attracted to the same man, different stages in his life, but the same man, might have predispositions in direction X, Y, or Z. But in the end, you've got to figure it's the environment that's informing, even on the most neutral of perspectives. It's the environment that's informing their conclusions. I don't mean to be flippant about something so serious, but
no, I think it's also a little bit about the times too, right? I mean, I'm sure in Brother Hemingway's time, there was absolutely no resources for treatment, for counseling, for understanding, or at least none that it would be considered respectable to pursue. And one of the things that has advanced, I think, quite well in the 40 years since Brother Hemingway took his life is there are a lot of resources, and there are a lot of celebrities and sports figures and other people speaking out about what anxiety and what depression can do to you, and the fact that there's no shame in seeking help.
Well, look, I can, of course, continue to refuse that 1982 was 40 years ago. It must be 20 years ago. After all, I'm a young man. But
think how I feel.
Yeah, but on the other hand, there are plenty of famous films and books about psychotherapy in the 60s and 70s. So there was, by the time Lester Hemingway took his life, there was a lot of there was a discipline around, and there was assistance to be had. But I certainly, of course, I'm not in any position to dispute your point that those lines of assistance have evolved markedly between then and now.
Well, we'll put some resources in the show notes in case anyone's interested or needs some of that help. But let's go back to a little bit lighter mood. I'm gonna pour myself another strain of my. It's actually really good. I'm gonna put this recipe in, and you're welcome, viewers, because it's very good.
I'm already on my second pour. So.
All right.
Well, cheers, Bryan.
Also from More Lessons from History.
is the story of the third eye. Tuesday Lobsang Rampa, who was the author of a sensational book called The Third Eye. Not as rude as some may imagine it to be as they tune in and listen. It is instead purportedly a memoir written by a man who had a hole drilled into his forehead, hence Third Eye. And Rampa, he claimed, grew up in Tibet, and his forehead eye, delivered to him by a suitably trained lama, so please don't try this at home, listeners and viewers, that third eye granted him supernatural powers like clairvoyance, for example.
Sure.
And so, published 1956, readers were gripped by this account of the life of a man who saw multiple yetis, who had discovered a mummified body of one of his past incarnations by being guided to it spiritually, explained the head hole drilling experience he'd undergone in grisly detail in the book. And the trouble for him was the book was so successful that interest in its author naturally grew. And it grew, in fact, until a private detective established that Tuesday Lobsang Rampa was Cyril Hoskin, born in Plympton in Devon, which is a little kind of suburban commuter town now. It was once a little separate town from Plymouth. I've been there. And he was born, Cyril Hoskin, to a local plumber and his wife. And of course, the press asked the suddenly shy Lobsang Rampa, as he fled to Ireland, and they found him anyway. Are you not, in fact, Cyril Hoskin? It's not an unfair question, you might think. Ah, yes, our hero replied. I can see why you might very well think that, but it's really very straightforward. I am, in fact, truly Tuesday Lobsang Rampa, and I am occupying the body formerly known as Cyril Hoskin, because the unfortunate Mr. Hoskin fell out of a tree in his garden in Thames Ditton whilst trying to photograph an owl. It's obvious now to explain, isn't it?
The detail is important for every story.
Absolutely. And as a result of this knock on the head in his garden in Thames Ditton as he fell, he entered a mental state which permitted me to communicate with him. And I, Tuesday Lobsang Rampa, explained my need for a body. And as it turns out, would you, Adam and Eve it, Cyril Hoskin was rather unhappy with his unrewarding life and thought it was a jolly good idea to give up the body he was squatting in for yours truly, Tuesday Lobsang Rampa. And well, here we are. It's obvious. Now, even putting aside, Bryan, the ethical questions around body occupancy,
body snatching,
but well, let's say surrender to you whilst the incumbent has given his consent whilst in concussed bird watching condition, the sadly cynical members of the Fourth Estate and their readers were generally not buying this explanation, even though, of course, it very helpfully set out the reasons for why the otherwise inexplicable fact that Cyril had never been to Tibet and never spoke any Tibetan, which you might otherwise have expected him to have. And so what if you don't believe me? Lobsang paraphrasingly said, prophets are never without honor except in their own country. So I'll emigrate to Canada and maintain to the credulous that I am indeed Tuesday Lobsang Rampa, a point I support, by the way, with something Bryan told me just before we started recording, that there is still a Facebook page of Tuesday Lobsang Rampa.
They're out there.
So, there's always somebody credulous around. And, whilst I'm in Canada, I'll bang out another 18 books which sell pretty well while I'm at it. Look, I mean, there are plenty of authors who long for such success. This might be thought a rather extreme way to achieve it. And Cyril Rampa maintained with a straight face that this was all true until his dying day. Couple footnotes. First is bright spot for Cyril Tuesday, Henry Lobsang Hoskin Rampa. Decently enough, whilst unsurprisingly keen to stress that this was an unmitigated hoax from start to finish. The Dalai Lama was frank in his praise that the book had helped to promote the cause of Tibet. Right, so even the worst kinds of charlatan can have good outcomes. And the second point I wanted to mention is the lesson from history here. And it's obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. Bird watching has become increasingly popular amongst gentlefolk drawn to peace and beauty in recent years. And those people are plainly unaware of the dangers being drawn into surrendering their bodies to the spirit of passing exiled Tibetans in so doing. And so, listeners to the Hidden History Happy Hour, you cannot say that we did not warn you.
Yeah, you're out photographing a great northern gamecock, and the next thing you know, you're a Dalai Lama.
Boom. Your body's being taken. There's also an interesting. I'm conscious that I said he wrote 18 successful books, and that's kind of true. in the interest of accuracy, I'll point out only 17 of them were by him. One was by a ghostwriter who piggybacked on Lobsang Ramper's fame to write a book about him meeting leaders from other planets. You may think his objection was, of course, about distorting the amazing truth he was otherwise telling. But funnily enough, having initially refused permission to print the book in the face of the terrible pressure that could be exercised by financial inducements,
Sure.
Ramper agreed to bend his hitherto iron commitment to authorial veracity, and it went to print with him doing this communication with extraterrestrials, as long as they made 2 very slight editorial changes and gave 10% of the profits to the Save a Cat League. So, philanthropy as well, right, comes into Lobsang Ramper's story.
Well, there's a certain amount of religious and philosophical and supernatural arrogance that infects us all, as our viewers will know from our last 2 episodes where you were out, romping around the world doing your shit. I've spent a bunch of time in Israel recently, and there is, I can't improve on Shakespeare, more twixt heaven and earth than is dreamt of in our philosophy. Now, does that support? Yes. Well, sure, but I don't need to name the character, but
I was just showing off. Remember, I told you I was deeply pretentious. You knew that anyway, but some of our listeners, it may have escaped them even after a year of the podcast. I just want to demonstrate my, I'm erudite. So anyway, go ahead.
Mission accomplished. There's just a lot out there. And, right. I think our viewers will know that my father was an Episcopal minister, but he strayed far from doctrine. And one of the things he said to me, which I'm sure wasn't an original idea by him, was, if you imagine an all-powerful supernatural being is going to reveal itself over centuries and generations to all societies on Earth, why would you believe that it's going to get written down the same way? And there are so many consistencies between at least the big fundamental religions that it could all be ascribed to translation error. Now, I'm not saying Tuesday is part of that, but as our listeners will know, as the grandson of the authors of Flying Saucer Pilgrimage, which includes a transcript of my grandfather's conversation with the alien collective, I'm not throwing stones.
Well, I hear you. Hinduism is a bit different to Christianity. The monotheistic faiths are different to the other faiths in a couple of fundamentals. But I'm going to accept a big part of your premise. And certainly if you think about all the ways that these faiths are meant to manifest themselves in learning the book, recital, sacrifice, charity for the poor, demonstration of rituals and rites, all those things are in different ways honoring thy father and mother, festivals around the year, pilgrimage. Those are all shared points, I suppose.
Now, of course, Marx would say all those things happened because humanity needed them at various points of time.
Right.
Yeah. And what did he say? If God didn't exist, man would have had to invent him. Which
that's what we say about our monarchy.
However many however many words that is, it's like 12, 13 words. Right. You can wrap your mind around that endlessly, but we're not going to do that today, ladies and gentlemen, because what we're going to do is finish out our first Hidden History Happy Hour of 2023, our second year, by saying, go to our website, tell us what episodes you want us to feature in our retrospective from last year. Next episode, we're going to talk about our London live event coming up. Join us. And Alex, cheers.
Cheers, my friend.